Trump, Putin, and Xi. The three are working in secrecy to prevent global war. They're working in secrecy with meetings that are not being publicized. You get a little bit of a report and then nothing more, it stops. And they're talking about the transition. They're talking about avoiding global war because the last three transitions involved a world war.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Silver Doctor special interview. Today's guest is returning guest, Dr. Jim Willie from golden-jackass.com. Jim Willie is the editor of the Hat Trick Letter, #1 source for independent analysis that you will not get anywhere else. I highly recommend subscribing to the Hat Trick Letter if you have not already, and you're about to get a taste of that wonderful insight that we can get nowhere else but from Jim Willie himself. Jim, thank you for joining us today on Silver Doctors.
Oh, it's a pleasure being on. You know, this is the end of the long holiday weekend. Well, not quite the end, but what am I saying? I lose track of what day it is. I actually look at I did it again. Thursday, it's not Monday. Wake up, Jim. Okay, that's how weird it's getting. The world and the U.S. and the West has turned into a bit of a nightmare twilight zone. And what's happening, I believe, is we're moving toward a period of reset. And I know that word has been bandied about a bit, and it's not been fully explained. It's not like you can do, I have a couple clients who said to me, Jim, I did a Google search of reset and it didn't come up with anything. So I'm not really sure what this is all about. Okay, let me redefine global financial reset. Retirement of the dollar as global currency reserve.
Okay.
A multi-step process. And it starts, I believe, with the acceleration in the East. By that I mean Asia, Russia, China, and increasingly Iran. Iran is very defiant. And I think they're going to become a cornerstone of the Eurasian trade zone. That's what I call it, the Eurasian trade zone. I don't like the Eurasian Economic Union. We've got EU is the United States, EEUU is European Union. What are they going to do? Triple E, triple U for the Eurasian Economic Union? I prefer calling it the Eurasian Trade Zone. It's increasingly being called like an extended Belt and Road Initiative. The new Silk Road, I like that. I like that because the Silk Road is going to have just putting a note here. The Silk Road is going to have a maritime component, which is a direct challenge to what George Orwell called Oceania. And Oceania, just think in simpler terms, it's the U.S., UK, the Anglo-American high seas dominance that includes I'm just going to say Australia and New Zealand, but maybe also Hong Kong. Okay. Let's start this off with a topic that you raised, the bond dumping.
Yes. We're hearing a lot of rumors over the past couple of weeks that it's China that's prepared to dump these bonds, Jim. And I've actually heard you say that it might not be just China, but that it could also be that there's some commercial banks and financial institutions that are looking to dump bonds, U.S. Treasury specifically, possibly the Guild, and also to purchase gold with that. So I'd like you to take it from there on possibly China dumping bonds and any other insight you might have for this bond dumping.
Okay, I think this is a much bigger phenomenon than just China, as you say. And I got to give the credit, or, got to be careful here, but Hugo Salinas Price is what I regard as the Mexican guru, the Mexican elder statesman in the sound money world. And he let it be known a few weeks ago that his sources were indicating that multiple central banks were dumping treasuries and buying gold with the proceeds. In other words, they were swapping treasuries for gold bullion in their bank management system. Remember that as of March 31st, pardon me, the Basel III rule kicked in, where gold was considered a countable asset. They call it a cash asset. I prefer calling it a countable asset. I think it's an abomination that the Treasury bond is the primary building block, cement blocks for their foundation in central bank reserves management. And gold was considered nothing. Gold was considered extraneous and uncountable. Now it's countable. So they're realizing, these central banks, we're not just talking about Britain, Euro Central Bank, Chinese, United States. We're talking about a lot of central banks. This could be Australia. It could be Brazil. It could be South Korea. It could be Italy. It could be a lot of countries. It could be Germany. It could be Sweden. It could be Belgium. It could be South Africa. It could be a lot of different countries. It could be Thailand. A lot of these countries have big holdings of treasury bonds. And here's the key to what Hugo Salinas Price was saying. It's not just that they were transferring and swapping treasuries for gold, but they were doing it on the QT. They were doing it on the double books. They were doing it on the sidelines using closely aligned financial firms that had, association with the central bank. For instance, in the United States, it might have been Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, maybe Morgan Stanley, to keep it a little bit more in the shadow. So these banks, like a South Korean bank, might have been deployed by their central bank, or a financial firm like a hedge fund with a huge lot of experience. They were hired by the central bank to manage the dumping of the treasury bonds to buy gold bullion. And it's all kept off the books. So they put it on the second journal, the second balance sheet. And when does that become well known? After the reset, after they want to admit, or after they're willing to admit, or in a position to take the risk of admitting. There are various levels of that. Okay, take South Korea. Now, if they buy a whole batch in the next 6 months, are they going to want to admit it at Christmas? January? They might wait another year. They might still be buying a little bit. Now, these agencies, these central banks, are not going to want to tell you anything. They're not going to want to say to you, hey, join us. We're all buying gold. We're dumping the dollar. The treasury bond is a dead piece of meat. Come on. Let's go. Let's jack up that price. Let's all work together. They're going to do the exact opposite. And you need to know that they're doing it so that you get on board and quit belly aching about the low price and start saying, thank you for that discount. We're on the verge of something big. Okay, that's the point. And the BIS, Bank for International Settlement, they in the nomenclature, they're more often just called Basel because they're located in Basel. And believe it or not, I got a client from Basel, Switzerland. and he says some very strange things. He doesn't reveal much of anything useful. He just says, well, Jim, it's just like any other big bank, and they've got a long reach, but I don't really know anything. Oh, my gosh. So the lower levels at the BIS don't know anything. And I said, well, if you ever stumble across something, let me know, like, central banks accumulating gold. I never heard from him. That's okay. I mean, he probably get killed or lose his job or get, run over by an unmarked black SUV if he tells anything important. We need to know. This is the beginning. We're now here. You can't say, oh, gosh, we're in the middle innings of this for those baseball enthusiasts. No, we're approaching the ninth inning. This does not have 2 years to go. And what I like to transition to is what I call the dual universe. And I think we're really moving toward the dual universe. Okay. And by that, I mean, as the dollar gives way, as the petrodollar is retired, and I'll have more comments about that in a minute, as the dumping of treasuries gives way to gold bullion, as trade payment moves away from treasury bills and goes toward, say, RMB payment or gold trade note payment or something like that, as these shifts take place, there's going to be an interim period, and I've been talking about this for almost 2 years. I call it the dual universe. And I remember who originally told me about this. It was an interesting conversation. But the gist of it is that the U.S. and its power merchants, this is a very important point, their power merchants are not in a position to say, okay, we're ready. Let's just retire the dollar and move straight to the gold standard, and everything will be coochie coo peachy keen. We're not anywhere near that point. We're dragging our asses at every step of the way toward the delay, toward the non-implementation. And therefore, I think we're going to slide reluctantly into this interim period that I call the dual universe. What's dual about it? Well, you're going to have a big increase in RMB, Chinese currency settlement for trade. You're going to have a lot of increase in RMB activity for economies, primarily in the East, in what I call the Eurasian trade zone. Okay, what countries? Okay, China, Russia, former Soviet republics, Pacific Rim, every East Asian nation except Japan. South Korea, they're going to increasingly use RMB. Thailand, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, Singapore, they're going to increasingly use RMB. A key nation to watch will be Australia, because they're in the UK Queen Commonwealth. They're in the Five Eyes for shared security information. And they also pretty much toe the line to wherever their British masters and American masters say, which includes sabotaging their entire government budget by over-purchasing military equipment like morons, when there's really no military threat. But they must toe the line in order to keep the big military contractors flush with cash, even though they're principally involved in the theft of cash. Okay, this dual universe is going to be the Chinese RMB in the East and the dollar in the West. And there's going to be a lot of clashes, and you're seeing it now. For instance, Iran is working deals with France and Germany, and they actually have the gall. It's funny at times. They actually have the gall to say, well, the initial payments for this special purpose vehicle, it's going to be called Instex, I-N-S-T-E-X, Instex. The initial payments are going to be used for medicines, food, and humanitarian stuff. Okay. You got to laugh at this stuff. Well, yeah, maybe the first 1%, and then comes the energy sales, and you're up to 60 suddenly. From 1 to 60, poof, just like that for energy sales. Okay, Germany needs energy. The biggest thorn in the U.S. side right now in the entire world is Germany. Germany is an energy import nation. Germany is a giant export product nation, product and services. Therefore, they want energy source that's reliable and at a good price. Therefore, Germany turns down the U.S. idiots trying to shove overly expensive LNG down their German throats, and they say, "Nein!" They don't want it. So we're doing sanctions against Nord Stream, the financial companies and construction company. One of the stupidest things you'd ever want to see the U.S. do in modern history. Sanctions against German allies. We're pushing them into the Russian camp. We're pushing them into other avenues that, for instance, will result. This is the dual universe. And the clash zone is Iran, Germany. I mean, Iran is like an Asian nation, but it's also a Middle East nation. Germany is a European nation, but a lot of ties with Russia now. Gazprom, okay, their energy source, their natural gas source. We're pushing the Germans into the Russian camp. And in response to 4 years, 4 full stupid years of Russian sanctions, the Germans have built numerous subsidiaries with the German brand inside the Russian economy to legally sell German products made with German managers, German equipment, but Russian workers and Russian plant, Russian location, Russian address. They're selling BMWs, they're selling Mercedes in Russia, and they're not in violation. So what's the consequence, you idiot, Obama? The German-Russian alliance is building a strong tie. Now, if you talk to Germans, I'm not going to say you get a distorted view. You'll get a realistic view, but the Germans that I talk to are kind of overwhelmed. They say, well, yeah, Jim, I hear your dual universe argument, but Germany still has both feet pointing toward the West. And if they're going to be making more moves toward the East, a lot of important changes have to happen in the Chancellery office and in the Parliament and in the press and in the security agencies, because they're dominated by the CIA.
Okay.
For instance, the German Parliament said, we don't want the sanctions. The Chancellery office said, we don't care what you think. We're keeping them. The Parliament said, we don't want the Arab influx. The Chancellery said, this is part of the globalist plan. We don't care what you think. The German, I call them industrial captains. That's the key to me. I call the German industrial captains all the CEOs and top executives of the major German corporations, and there are hundreds of them. And they don't give a shit about the Russian sanctions. They're trying to work around them, and now they're directly trampling on them. Okay, so the dual universe is going to have a lot of buffer zone fights, like in Iran and Germany. And add Saudi Arabia to that. The Saudi Arabia, this is a nice transition to the petrodollar here, Paul. Let me just grab a sip. If you want to make a comment, you're welcome.
Just for a comment on that, one of the things that I find interesting is you're talking about dragging their feet, and one of the ways that I look at that is, just a couple of days ago, the Treasury Department refused to recognize China as a currency manipulator. But a year ago, President Trump said that they were a currency manipulator. So it seems like there's just all these things that keep throwing us off. Like, are they a currency manipulator? Are they not a currency manipulator? As a way of dragging their feet, like you're talking about, if that even makes sense. Yeah. And then on top of it, with Germany coming into the mix, that's not what we're really hearing about. What we're really hearing about is, the bad things coming out of Russia, in quotes, the bad things coming out of China, in quotes. But Germany, as they're building up their relations with Russia, and as they're building up their business relations, more importantly with Russia, that's not the stuff that's getting the press time here.
No. This currency manipulator, it's funny. It's funny. What country is the biggest currency manipulator?
The United States is.
Exactly. So this is the pot calling the kettle black. Okay, we're using currency manipulator as sort of a cover for not sanctions, but for preliminary actions that could lead to sanctions. And it's really quite cowardly, because the currency manipulation goes on with the Department of Treasury. Like, for instance, with the Turkish lira. Like, for instance, with the Iranian rial. We're trying to harm their nations by giving them inflation, harming their currency, and making everything more expensive. It's really quite funny. This petrodollar, I started covering the elements of the petrodollar around 2015. I started noticing things like, well, we're having a tremendous decline in the official count of derivatives. How did it move from 1.4 quadrillion, which is 1,400 trillion, down to 750 trillion, almost in half? What happened? What got liquidated? What got dissolved? What happened? I think a tremendous amount of petrodollar derivatives got liquidated. And what are they? Well, they're links between the dollar and the crude oil price. There are links between the euro and the crude oil price. There are links between the British pound and the crude oil price. In other words, there are links between the major currencies and the crude oil price. Now you're starting to see some strange stuff going on. Okay, it used to be that when the dollar weakened, you saw the oil price go up. When the dollar got stronger, you saw the oil price go down. Now you're seeing the dollar go up and the oil price go up. There's a little bit of a disconnect. It's not a perfect argument, but what you used to see years ago, you're not seeing much anymore. That's just one element. But the biggest factor to me to demonstrate the decline of the petrodollar is two things. It's China sales and it's Russian alliance. Let's get this in order. If you look at the Aramco balance sheet, and I posted this in the May newsletter last week, the Aramco Saudi, this is basically the Saudi monopoly. It's their oil and petrochemical monopoly. It's their giant conglomerate. If you look at the Aramco balance sheet, you'll see $1 billion worth of RMB on it. Wasn't there a year ago. They're selling oil in Chinese currency. Wake up. The U.S. press doesn't want to admit this. They don't want to report it. Now, the Saudis are using their income to cover their costs. But the balance sheet is where their savings account is. It's where their profit margin is lodged. And what's unique about this right now is that if you add together the British pound and the Japanese yen portion to their Aramco balance sheet, the RMB is bigger than both combined. Okay, something's big going on, and it's Chinese buying oil from the Saudis, paying in their own currency, not in the dollar. If Saudi Arabia had done this 15 years ago, they would have been invaded and there would have been a coup d'etat. This is part of what I call the dual universe. We're transitioning into the no longer dominant petrodollar. Petrodollar basically means you want to buy oil, the tanker's coming in, get your treasury bills ready because that's how you pay for it. Mm-hmm. And after they pay for it, okay, you Gulf monarchies of oil, you got all your savings and it's all in dollars, where you got to keep it in dollars. The dollar recycle, the petrodollar recycle, it stays in U.S. treasuries. And it stayed so much for the Saudis that we stole $3 trillion of theirs. We stole $3 trillion. We stole $3,000 billion worth of Saudi treasury bonds. Trump admitted it. And we're using kind of a fake facade bullshit argument that the Saudis were responsible for 9/11, so we're freezing all these accounts. And it leaked over into, well, I'm not sure we're going to give back $3 trillion in Saudi treasuries. They accumulated treasuries over the course of 40 years, and now a big piece of their savings will be stolen. This is how we're keeping the dollar going.
Okay, and that's just going to make them turn even faster towards China.
Exactly. Well, they make the Chinese turn even faster away from the dollar and toward the Russia, old Soviet republics, Iran, that entire union, the Eurasian trade zone. It's going to force the Chinese to say, oh, okay, you're talking about the Saudis turning away. Yes. I'm sorry. The Chinese will align more, but the Saudis will say, we're fed up with you. And we got a gun at their heads. We're providing them security along with Israel. And the whole Saudi-Israeli connection is going to be exposed. The Saudis have had their highest level of security provided by Israel for 20 years. Yet they talk about being anti-Israel. It's one of the biggest nonsensical pieces of crap in the propaganda manual. Okay, so China is buying Saudi oil and paying in RMB. That is a dagger in the heart of the petrodollar. But there's more, and it's more an alliance and involves Russia. Russia has done something very clever. I mentioned this in a number of interviews, but it really bears repeating. The Russians look for nations in trouble, nations that are oil producers, nations that are in debt, nations that are in a liquidity jam, and they promise to buy their oil. The Saudis are selling oil to Russia. Russia's an exporter. They don't buy anything. They don't need to buy. They're independent. They're self-sufficient. Why are the Russians buying Saudi oil? It's not for mixing and viscosity reasons. Oh, no, no. That's the reason they're buying Venezuelan oil. The Venezuelans had a different problem. They've got a huge amount of oil reserves, but it's all very thick. They call it heavy grade Orinoco region thick oil. Okay. They need Nigerian light sweet crude oil to mix with their heavy oil to make it marketable and to sell it in the global market. But they're lacking liquidity. So they have had a big jam in Venezuela, and they're not exporting oil because they don't have enough to buy the Nigerian oil. Enter the Russians. They say, you're in trouble. Remember the formula. In trouble, big debts, liquidity problems. So the Russians offer to buy Venezuelan oil. So they ship the heavy oil to Russia, and Russia processes it. Why do the Russians buy Saudi oil? To break up the petrodollar and to assure that the Saudis, when they get sick and tired of the Anglo-American influence, and they get sick and tired of the theft of $3,000 billion of treasury bonds, and when they get sick and tired of the terrorism that the U.S. sponsors and calls it ISIS, the Saudis will be receptive to moving with Russia into the alliance and the Eurasian trade zone. Qatar is going to move into it. Oman will move into it. And I think only the dumbest, slowest oil monarchies in the Gulf region will stick with the dollar. The majority will move east. So the Chinese and Russians are playing a role to kill the petrodollar. It's not just conducting trade, like you build a bridge, how are you going to pay for it? And all the toll taking, what's it going to be? Dollar? No. The dollar's out of the picture. In fact, this is a nice transition to the Belt and Road. There's something called the indirect exchange. And I think China, okay, if you look under the official stats, Paul, you see China has $1 trillion, 1.0 something trillion dollars worth of treasury bonds. Really? I'd like to see that verified. I'd like to know what swap contracts they have. I'd like to know what long-term African contracts they've got. I'd like to know what long-term Pakistani contracts they've got. I'd like to know what they've swapped out, what the total is, and you subtract that from 1.0 trillion, which is 1,000 billion. If I had to guess, I'd say the Chinese have $200 to $400 billion of exposure. Now, the Russians gave away a method. Well, they didn't give it away. The Voice explained it so that I could give it away. About 6 months ago, the Russians made a big fuss and said, we're selling our last $60 billion worth of treasury bonds and we're going to convert it to gold. No, they didn't. They had $60 billion in European banks in the form of treasury bonds, and they borrowed against it, one-on-one. And with that money, they bought a big truckload of gold bars. So now what are they? Do they own treasuries? Yeah, but are they net neutral on the dollar? Yes, also. Okay, so that's how it's done. The Chinese might have posted treasuries in order to buy Australian gold. They might have posted treasuries to buy a shitload of Iranian gold. No one talks about the hidden Iranian troves of gold. Remember, they had 5,000 years of something called the Persian Empire. They've been collecting gold for almost as long as China has, and they're never in the news for their gold. Why did we oust Mossadegh and put in the Shah in Iran? To get access to their gold. We're not stupid with our criminal military and political activities. Okay, the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is going to be financed I don't know the percentages. I think a large portion of the projects for the Belt and Road, which is Chinese-led infrastructure and large projects, a wide variety. I believe the Chinese are going to post the funding in the form of treasury bonds. They're going to dump treasury bonds in order to finance the Eurasian trade zone infrastructure. If that isn't a lethal blow to U.S. global dominance, economically and financially, I don't know what is. I think they're going to dump $100 billion, $200 billion, $300 billion, whatever they don't have in the swap neutral, in what they neutralize with swap contracts.
Okay.
This is very important. Now, if you take a look at the projects in the Belt and Road Initiative, it's huge bridges, it's big port facilities, it's big trains and networks, it's high-speed trains. Look at it this way. A very high-speed train will carry people as passengers. And right now there's something that's connecting Europe to China that goes 500 miles an hour. I believe it's a maglev, which means magnetic levitation. There's no contact. There's no friction. It's like with magnetism, it maintains its position, and then it uses whatever energy source to fly. And it flies at 3 inches off the ground. And it goes like a bullet. They call them bullet trains. The U.S. has them, but they're only connecting Langley in Virginia to CIA West in Denver. Underground, 500 miles an hour. We have it. It's not for passenger service. They do have some maglev at lower speeds that are going to be for freight, and that carrying heavier loads, much lower speeds. I don't know the exact details of it, but they have some trains that are maybe half the speed compared to the human trafficking, passengers. Okay, this Belt and Road, it's got more. It's not just transportation ports. It's things like I think there's going to be some funding of some large natural gas, what do you call it, holding facilities. I don't know the right word. It's not warehouse. Holding facilities. Like there's a giant one that the Russians are building now in Turkey. The last connection for the Turkish stream was just made a month and a half ago. I had it in the April newsletter. I had a nice picture. Might have been March, can't remember exactly, but a beautiful picture from an aerial view. They lift up the two giant, like 4 feet diameter tubes, maybe 5. They lift them both up and they make a connection. They call it the final tie-in. After the connection, they drop down the big pipes and they rest like 50 meters deep on the bed, the seabed. Okay, so the final tie-in has happened. So, just a little sideline, how'd that Russian sanction work out? They completed the Turkish stream after the Ukrainian one was blocked. So the U.S. did a great job in blocking Ukraine, in destroying the nation, in wrecking their economy, and creating a failed state. But it didn't do anything to stop the Russian supply of gas to Western Europe. Everything we've done in foreign policy since 9/11 has been a dismal, utter failure. Everything. Okay, the new Silk Road. Quick comment. George Orwell talked about Oceania versus Eurasia. Mm-hmm. And what he was trying to tell you was that the British bankers have a vested interest in not letting Europe unite with Russia. And remember back then, China was kind of sleepy. China was several provinces, maybe a united king, but a lot of divisions and no organization, and just a lot of wealth being accumulated, but no national movement or organized agenda. More like, several fiefdoms, and they're all doing pretty well. And they were ripe for the British invasion in Hong Kong and the opium influx. That was to keep them asleep. But George Orwell explained that the British bankers don't want Russia and Germany to unite. So they created a war. And it was a bloody war and a painful war. And Americans don't quite realize that there were 10 times as many deaths in Russia as there were for American soldiers. It might have been more like about 30 times as many. So now what you're seeing is kind of like a reversal of the George Orwell principles. I think Oceania is going to give way to Eurasia. It's going to be much bigger than that. The Chinese are building their maritime network. So Oceania better get ready for the Eurasian trade zone and their new Silk Road that has ports. Okay, what are the ports? I think the Chinese are going to build a port network that involves the following different nations. Pakistan. Now that's in their backyard. Pakistan's a neighbor to China. They have a frontier border. I've been told that the Chinese have poured $100 billion into the port facility. It's Gwadar. Gwadar, Gwadar. And the Chinese, just to make sure that it's not vulnerable to Western attack from their usual terrorist sources, the Chinese put over 20,000 troops there. So there are a lot of Chinese people. There are numerous military soldiers, and they're building a massive port facility, which I believe will connect to Europe. Okay, that's one. There are going to be Iranian ports. The Iranians will have port facilities. I think you're going to see more and more news about this in the coming year. And the design, the plan will be that Iran will be a gateway to Africa. And the gateway to Africa will involve the Djibouti port, which I think it will expand. I think it will expand and become very important for supplying Kenya and developing nations in Africa and a lot more. Another port facility will be, I think Brazil is going to have a port facility, part of the Eurasian trade zone. It's going to be controversial, probably going to be Rio de Janeiro. The Chinese have already built a Rio port. I have information, and this is not, unique, but I have information that indicates that there's a port in Brazil that extends 2 miles out in the water. 2 miles. This is going to be big. Other port facilities, naturally, you're going to see Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. They're all going to expand their ports. A good nation to watch will be Australia. I think this is going to be very big as the Chinese realize they're going to have connections to Europe by rail and by other means. And they're going to be a lot of connections and a lot of efficiencies. There's going to be some airport trafficking with cargo. There's going to be, in concert with all that, there's going to be port facilities built. And these port facilities are going to augment the land lines. So they're calling it the New Silk World Order. The New Silk World Order is a challenge to the New World Order that Bush and the clown trilateralists talked about. And it's not happening. The globalist plan is not happening. In fact, you can look at Germany and France and Italy and see how it's fracturing. It's not happening, and I don't think it's going to happen. The only thing that we're likely to see as an end result, a climax for the New World Order, will be contamination. I mean, like the spread of viruses, the spread of tainted food, and the spread of contaminated water. And all three are well along in the United States, and people better beware.
And it's also interesting, there's a lot of developments with swine flu in China right now. The timing is almost uncanny. Because some of the things that I'm hearing you say right now, Jim, is, as China and Russia are expanding these facilities and embarking on business relationships with other countries, seems like the United States strategy has not been to go directly after Russia and China per se, but to go after the countries that they're expanding in. For example, there's been a lot of pressure and chaos in Pakistan lately. We know what's been going on in Iran lately. But what is the United States going to do as these developments in Brazil become more in the open? What is the United States going to do as developments in Singapore, for example, become more open? It's one of those things where, we're trying to attack all the countries that China and Russia are developing these relationships with, but it really is just turning out to be an unstoppable force. And now what you're saying makes sense, because all of a sudden, China has massive problems with hogs dying, right? Spreading a virus. And, I used to live in North Carolina, and it's very interesting where, within one small geographical area, right, there was a mental institution, a federal prison, a USDA facility, and a bioweapons facility, So it's like, these things exist, right? We know about the Tuskegee experiment and infecting, African Americans with syphilis and not telling them. So, what we can't directly attack China and Russia. So what I'm hearing you tie this into is that we're going after everything that they're trying to develop.
I agree. And let me point something about the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, the CDC. Why are they permitted to have patents for vaccines? They benefit from the spread of viruses. Now, if you look closely at the CDC, you will notice they are working closely with the companies that are spreading laced vaccines, which then require vaccines. I mean, this is really sick, but the laced vaccines are resulting in more vaccinations, which spread more laced vaccines. And now you have the social networks censoring information about laced vaccines. By laced, I mean they contain the virus they're supposed to protect you from. Mm-hmm. And now you're getting legislation, like in the state of California, for mandatory vaccinations. In other words, mandatory spread of virus to the most vulnerable members of our society, the children. Adults are being forced into this also. Okay, you made a great point. We're going after the nations that are in alliance with the Eurasian Trade Zone. Okay, you left out Germany. Germany is making alliances with Russia, so we're going after them. But while you were talking, I made a list. We're going after Iran because they have strong connections with China and they have new connections with Germany. We're going after the Union of South Africa. Now, it's little known to the West what's going on in South Africa, but there's a movement in Johannesburg for confiscating the white-owned farms. And I just read this today. The British have put up something like 50, I don't know, I got to be honest, I don't know if it's 50 million or 50 billion. I doubt it's 50 million, but let me just say in general, the British are putting up funds to assist the South African government in confiscating the white-owned farms. Whew. The British have gotten in the way with respect to the South African gold mining industry. So that was all expected. Why was South Africa brought into the BRIC? Brazil, Russia, India, China. And now it's BRICS. Well, 3 years ago it was BRICS. South Africa was going to be their gold provider. I think the Turks are eventually going to become the brokers for the BRICS nations and the Eurasian Trade Zone. The Turks are going to be the agents for converting treasury bonds and euro bonds into gold bullion for the individual nation's central bank storage. Okay. We're interfering with Brazil. We're getting in the way of their presidential elections. We're trying to do strong-arm methods to prevent the Russians from getting coltan. Coltan is coltan. It's a metal. It's called blue gold. It's a beautiful, like a blue quartz-like crystal. That's not doing it justice, but it's a beautiful dark blue. It looks like a big gem, but it contains tantalum, which is very important for certain devices like cell phones. Tantalum is very important. It's a strategic metal now. It's a strategic ore. And Brazil is loaded with it. So U.S. is trying to get in the way and maybe get some long-term coltan contracts, and it's not working very well. The U.S. is getting in the way with Australia. Australia has made a number of big policy changes in the last year or more, like for forcing divestiture of Chinese-owned ports, forcing divestiture of Chinese-owned mining firms, and forcing obstacles to put in the way for Chinese to buy property in Australia. So in a sense, you could say Australia is trying to divest itself from Chinese ownership in whatever sense is relevant. Okay, this is how we're interfering. United States does nasty things instead of doing the right thing. And it's often said that the United States will do all the wrong things until it's clear that they must do the right thing. I'm not sure about that anymore. Not after 9/11. I think we do the wrong thing and then we amplify it. For instance, in 2008, we had the Lehman incident, which was a climax failure. It was a murder. It was a corporate murder by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. What they did was they had lousy underwriting for mortgage bonds. They had, crazy contracts like no income mortgage loans. I mean, give me a break. Ninja, no income, no job or assets. Ninja, but you can get a mortgage. And then they falsified with the rating agency bribery. They falsified to call them AAA. And then they did more. They created the MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registry Service or system. And that's basically for title registrations. But they defrauded that, made it a huge fraud box where mortgages, they're called secure stream mortgages. You get 100 of them together, you put them into a bond, and you call it a mortgage bond. But they were using the same mortgage income stream from several homes with other bonds. And there was sometimes 2 and 3. The average I heard was 2.5, 2.4. So that all blew up. And instead of reforming, we did the exact same thing with treasury bonds. Now they used to call the mortgage bonds the subprime bond. I call the treasury bond the global subprime bond. And it's going to blow up. It is blowing up. And we've got tremendous pressures right now in the bond market. We've never seen treasury yield inversions like we've seen in the last few months. We've never seen anything like this. They tried to tighten starting a year or two ago, and it was a dismal failure. So they're trying to stop the tightening and move toward gradual easing again, but they can't do it quickly or they'll cause an absolute storm from a complete flip. They did a flip from easing to tightening. That was thunder here. And now they cannot go from tightening to easing because it will appear like their tightening was a grand failure. They can't do that. So they're going from tightening to neutral. And soon they're going to go to easing again, which will be an admission that their 2 to 3 year experiment to tightening was a dismal failure. It caused stock market declines. It's causing economic declines. It's causing global bond dumping. And all this is happening while Trump is engaged with his stupid trade war. I thought he was a good student of business, and I'm not convinced of that anymore. I'm convinced that he's now pretty much a neocon instrument that sits in the White House chair. I don't want to get into
theory. That's been my working theory, that he's set up to be the fall guy to take the blame. And I truly do not have a good outlook for what's coming in 2020. That's a different topic altogether, but I would agree with you on there, because my point is, a sheep doesn't recognize a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? So, it's very possible that a lot of people don't see, what's happening under the surface here.
Well, Trump might have started out as a white knight. That's my description. But as time passed, the Wall Street and Pentagon influence just got too much. I look to see who's his Secretary of State and who's his Secretary of Defense. They go from bad to worse. I used to think, well, he's going to set them up to fail and then replace with something better. No, he set them up to fail and he put in someone who's worse. Not only that, but when Venezuela became ripe for a vulnerable action, we sent Elliott Abrams to be the envoy. This is a criminal. This is a neocon criminal who has no positive track record whatsoever. Now, I think what's happened with Trump is that he got compromised. And there are a lot of theories out there. There's nothing for sure. But the two biggest ones that I heard, that I believe, are that they've got some goods on Trump from way back that might have to do with young women, girls. He went to Lolita Island. What did he do? Just drink martinis and catch a tan? Wake up. He went there to have some fun, and he probably got lied to on her age. There might have been a whole lot more involved in that. I don't have information. That's just my suspicion. What else do they have on him? Well, he seemed to just stop. He did a full stop in 3 or 4 major areas after the Cohen files were confiscated. I don't want to get into a long Trump discussion, but I will say this regarding the trade talks. I think we've made some agreements in principle having to do with currency, having to do with gold, pricing, having to do with currency adjustments relative to each other, in other words, dollar devaluation, and involving trade deficit enforcements. I think we made agreements in principle on all 3. And we walked out of the room when it came time to make an agreement on implementing with a timetable. And we started, casting aspersions and, throwing mud and going after Huawei. The attack against Huawei will not succeed. We've not had not one successful foreign policy initiative since 2001. I say since 2001 because that's when the fascists took over. They called themselves neocons. As what? Neoconservative? How about neo-Nazi? That's their bloodline. Take a look at Mueller and Rosenstein, the heads of SS and the Gestapo. Wake up, people. Their fathers were Nazis. And we have to tolerate this ongoing saga of the Russian dossier. When are they going to release the documents and start actual prosecution for treason? These are Nazis. They like to be called neocons because the word Nazi doesn't really smell good. We've lost our prestige, Paul. This is a good closing theme. I made a list. It's disturbing. These are items, these are factors, these are issues that are now coming to the fore, that are wrecking the U.S. prestige, that are ruining the trust in the United States, and that are tarnishing in a very powerful way our national image. I'm going to rattle them off. I'm not going to get into a discussion on each one. The U.S. government now has $22 trillion in debt. It's growing by over $1 trillion a year. It doubled under Obama after having doubled under Bush 2. We have $20 to $21 trillion, which is a million, $21 trillion of missing money. Now, you need to get a perspective on a trillion. People really need to think about this. If you stack $1 bills and you have 1 million of them, you're as high as the Empire State Building. If you stack $1 bills and you have 1 billion of them, you're up into the stratosphere. If you stack $1 trillion and you don't get disturbed by the Earth's rotation, it'll go a quarter of the way to the moon. If you stack $100 bills in pallets, you can do it like 5 stories high and cover a football field 5 times over. You really need to think about what $1 trillion is. Now, our trade deficit when Trump took office was about 700 trillion, upper 600s. It's now 920. Okay, so we got the government deficit and we've got the trade deficit. And if you want to back the dollar with something tangible like gold, let's just say, for argument's sake, $1,300 gold price. If we have a $920 billion trade deficit It translates to 20,000 tons of gold. That's more than double what Fort Knox used to have before Bush, Clinton, and Rubin stole it. The U.S. military budget, it's bigger than the rest of the world combined. We got predatory actions that we do on the financial front, like attacking the Iran currency, like attacking the Turkish currency, and we've also attacked, to some degree, the Brazilian real currency. We use finances as a weapon. We've weaponized the dollar. That's not a nice thing to do. We have trade war friction with our biggest trade partner, China. We you know, this is sick, but with the Hong Kong transfer in 1999, we also set up most favored nation status for the Chinese. They lent us 5,000 tons of gold. We reneged on it and never gave it back. And now we're calling them bad boys. We're calling them, you know, espionage agents with Huawei, when we're the espionage agents, and Huawei refuses to participate in the chips and their backdoor entry to Langley. We've got false demand for treasury bonds. We're relying on the U.S. Department of Treasury to buy the bulk. I don't have the figures. If I had to guess, I'd say it's between 40 and 70%. The U.S. Treasury Department is buying our own treasury bonds. They're using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a multi-trillion-dollar core operating room. We're using interest rate swap derivatives to fabricate bond demand. And the world is figuring it out because our treasury auctions are not going well, and now our primary dealers are stuffed with treasuries they can't sell. We got corruption of the debt rating agencies. These are all causing lost prestige. When the Standard & Poor's in 2011 declared the United States government debt as one notch in downgrade, the executive for Standard & Poor's got death threats and he had to resign. We're using sanctions for economic motives, not political motives. It used to be like, we'll do sanctions against South Africa for apartheid, you know, separating blacks and whites in their society and business and whatever. Now we're using sanctions against the Germans because we want them to buy our natural gas, LNG. This is not going to go over well. We're using sanctions against Iran and claiming that they're, you know, agents of weapons for mass destruction. Come on, give me a break. These claims are falling on deaf ears. We're abusing NATO. NATO has many roles, and one big role is moving heroin from Afghanistan. We lost Turkey and then Sirlik, but that just meant that we had to amplify the heroin movement to Aviano in Italy and Ramstein in Germany. And anyone who doesn't understand this is 20 years behind the curve. We're growing heroin. When we moved into Afghanistan, remember the old story, the justification for Afghanistan? Well, they're responsible for 9/11. Oh my gosh, yeah. These guys who have turbans in the caves with no internet access organized an attack on the United States and the World Trade. Oh, come on, this is so stupid. But do you remember the justification? We're going to develop their mineral resources. Afghanistan is rich in metals, gold, silver, iron, aluminum, copper. We're going to develop and do nation building. We built up their heroin production and enlisted 18 of 20 Taliban chiefs to be part of it, and 2 never signed on. So there was a constant battle against the Taliban, and that's all we ever heard about. The 2 of the 20. We never heard about the 18 that were in our pocket. This is now understood better. It's $800 billion a year plus vastly reduced input costs for opium and opiates, opioids, painkillers for big pharma. So after 10 years of the Afghan war, we suddenly have an opioid addiction problem in the United States, but people are often too damn stupid to make the connection. we have banks that are now guilty of fraud, and it's just so widespread understood. It started with 2008, the TARP fund. They stole $700 billion worth of congressional authorized funds that were designed and earmarked for commercial credit. Instead, Wall Street changed it and bought preferred stock, which is largely what the owners of the banks use for their equity share of the bank ownership. In other words, it was stolen to become a bank nationalization rescue. We export terrorism. Whenever I hear about, oh my gosh, look at the United States is claiming that some other nation's a terrorist agent, are they overlooking Langley? I could go on. There's so many more. Pressure to install political puppets that are favorable to the United States. That's happening in Lithuania and Brazil. Abuse of the global currency reserve. We import products and we export fraudulent treasury bonds. And the world is going to say we don't want them much anymore. So that's when we're going to have to go to the gold trade note. That's when you're going to start to see some severe shortages in the United States economy. We have embassy abuse. The Iraq embassy for the United States is being used now for weapons, I think black market weapons distribution in a network. We're using embassies for bioweapons transfers under the cover of embassy diplomatic pouches. We're assassinating heads of state. We're provoking unendingly war in the South China Sea. I got to tell this story. It's real quick. I have a client, lives in Hong Kong, big building. They got a doorman, and the doorman told my client, your son is involved in the demonstrations in Hong Kong against the Chinese for the South China Sea island dispute. My client, let's just say he's 50 years old. So he's got a son, 25, and the doorman tells him, your son is taking money and going out there yelling and bitching and hooting with a placard. He's given a placard, and he just yells and hoots all day long, and he gets paid $150 a day. Okay, my client told me that the George Soros Fund was funding these guys in Hong Kong for $150 a day to hold a placard, run around, yell and hoot. And I asked, do you have any more information on the details of how this works? And he said, yeah, the organizers get, I think, $500 a day. And they go out and recruit, and they pay people $150 to hold placards and yell and hoot. Okay, this is on the U.S. news, and we're told it's spontaneous. No, this is from George Soros, and this is what we do. We're losing prestige because it's all becoming revealed. You know, they said the Soviet Union was brought down by faxes, cell phones, and photocopying machines. I think the dollar is going to be brought down by recognition of derivatives and false demand, recognition of terrorism and its sources by means of social networks, and many other different means. We can't control the social networks. We can't control the internet. We can't control the information flow, and it's working against the dollar. The world is waking up. I mean, you're seeing things like the Yellow Jackets in France. This is a very spontaneous organization that's powerful. And to try to interrupt it, the bad boys burned Notre Dame. That was sabotage. That wasn't, you know, like faulty wiring from an old building. Come on. I don't know what phony, nonsensical reasons they're telling us now. But this is getting dangerous. The dollar's not going to survive this. The dollar's going to be replaced by something legitimate. There's an old saying from the von Mises School of Sound Money. It's a school of economics. The saying is that when you corrupt a legitimate gold currency, you move to a fake paper currency. And when the fake paper currency runs its course, and this one has run over 45 years, the previous record was 31. when the paper fake currency runs its course, it cannot be replaced with another paper currency. You can't say, well, the Chinese have a better RMB. It's not backed by anything, but we're going to move to that, and that'll be the standard, and that'll be the basis for banking reserves and central banks. And we'll have a transition. No, it won't work. It won't work because there's debt suffocation. It's not just debt suffocation, which means too much money has to be devoted toward servicing debt. It's coupled with something that's very pernicious. New debt, new credit introduced to the system becomes inefficient. And right now it takes over $4 new of credit to create $1 of economic activity. And you can say, well, they need more debt in order to service the old debt. Well, that's partly true, but it's not quite like that anymore. We've got inefficiency of the system. We've got misallocation of assets. We've got inadequate training of workers. This is all a consequence of bad money. I irritated my father very badly, and I stopped doing it. 10 years, I started calling the dollar toxic. And my dad said, well, then maybe you don't want any more of my toxic dollars. And I said, no, keep it. Keep them coming, Dad. Keep those big Christmas gifts coming. Sorry about that. I'll stop calling it toxic. I'll just say that there are a lot of problems caused in the global financial system by not having a legitimate backing to the currency. I'm not going to say the dollar toxic anymore. They're all damaged. The euro's damaged. Okay, when you look at the IMF basket, it's the euro, the British pound, the dollar, the yen, and now for 2 years, we've got the we got the Chinese RMB. The Chinese got their 10% or whatever. So these are the major currencies, and they're not healthy. They're just official. Now, when I cited the von Mises corollary. A paper currency, when it fails, cannot be replaced by a paper currency, which means, interpret this, the IMF has what they call the special drawing rights. And it's a currency that's made up of the basket of the 5 cited major currencies. They've got their ratios. And the biggest one is a dollar. It's over 40%. They cannot, at the IMF, with Basel coordination, they cannot create a basket of fiat currencies to replace the dollar fiat currency. This is what will not succeed. And I think Basel understands that. So they've moved away in the last 3 years from their notion of a basket of SDR currencies replacing the dollar. They talked about the SDR bond replacing the treasury bond in the global central banks. That is part and parcel exactly to replacing the dollar with the SDR. They realize it doesn't work, and it can't work, and it will not work. So they're moving toward the SDR gold-backed currency. And my final point, Paul, will be why it will fail. 2 major points: transparency and decentralization. The Basel plan will be for a centralized, non-transparent solution with a gold-backed SDR. They might even put on a crypto element to it. But it will not work because the world is demanding 2 things. Not just that it's a gold platform, but they're demanding transparency. The world is sick and tired of these giant silo banks with hidden balance sheets, second journals, corrupt narco trafficking, money laundering, bond fraud, giant derivatives accounts, no transparency. They're sick of it, but they're also sick of the centralization behind the 4 or 5 major central banks of the world. So we got to move toward transparency. We've got to move toward decentralization, and gold will be the answer. It's going to be a transition period that, as I explained, will involve the dual universe. RMB in the east, dollar in the west, a lot of clashes at the frontier. It's going to be fun and interesting to watch the clashes, because I regard it being fun because I have taken war out of the equation. I studied what happened in Syria. I studied what happened in Ukraine. I studied what happened in the Black Sea. I studied what happened near Diego Garcia and the Indian Ocean. And the conclusion is simple. U.S. military is not number one. That's why we backed out of Syria. There's something what I call the TPX trio, the TPX triumvirate: Trump, Putin, and Xi. The three are working in secrecy to prevent global war. They're working in secrecy with meetings that are not being publicized. You get a little bit of a report and then nothing more, it stops. And they're talking about the transition. They're talking about avoiding global war because the last three transitions involved a world war. We don't want a world war. The neocons do. The neocons want to destroy the planet Earth. And that's a story for another day. But it's not going to work out. So I'm actually enjoying the observation seat in how the U.S. is screwing up with Germany. I'm enjoying the observation seat on how we're screwing up with Iran. Look, we built up troops, we built up naval vessels around Venezuela 2 months ago and did nothing. I said 2 months ago, we will do nothing. Now we're building up the same against Iran, and I'm saying we will do nothing. What we've done now is we up the ante on a false bluff. We're going to get called and we're going to retreat. Iran has more defenses than Venezuela. We're not going to do anything there. If we didn't do any, guys, I got into battles with some of my colleagues in 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, and 12, where they were saying, we're going to have a war with Iran. And I said no in 08. I said no in 09. I said no in 10. I said no in 11. I said no in 12. And I said, are you going to continue this? Because it's just dead wrong. Here we are in 19, and they stopped saying we're going to have a war. I've had now other important, they're like contributing clients. I've got 3 or 4 of them. They're really smart people. One of them is in South Florida, and if he's hearing this, my hat's off to you. He's a former Wall Street fund manager, very bright guy, send me stuff all the time. So I get a lot of help with this, not just from my colleagues. I have a second ring, and they're very important to me. They're like a sounding board sometimes, but also a source. So, one of the most devastating things that can happen, Paul, to a currency that's not backed is that it loses its trust, confidence, and prestige. And the U.S. is losing theirs in a big way. So we're not going to have Basel coming to the rescue with their plan. They're discredited because their babies are the major central banks. So they're not going to be told, okay, we'll let you do a redo. We'll let you do a redesign of your central bank plan because we trust you. We don't trust you. Nobody trusts. The Chinese certainly don't. Chinese neighbors have big Swiss treasure troves of gold that are not being returned. We might see the onset of the Manchu dynasty and a new nation formed with part of China, Manchuria, and Manchuria is part of China, Mongolia, and say North Korea. We might have a new nation formed. I don't know. It might include South Korea. I don't know. These are all semi-far-fetched concepts. I'm not in control. I'm a watcher. But I look to see what's coming, and I try to get out in front of it so my clients will benefit from the information.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Willie at the beginning of the interview hit on the fact that things are happening behind the scene, and we are not being told about it, and we will not be told about it. This is one of the reasons why we need to prepare ahead of time, because there will be no warning given unless you are in that very close inner circle. For the sake of humanity, let's hope that you are correct, Jim, and that the TPX prevails. That would be the best for everything and the only way to avoid World War III. Jim Willie is the editor of the Hat Trick Letter, but you do offer a lot of free stuff at golden-jackass.com. So check that out on the public side. Subscribe to his newsletter for information that you cannot get anywhere else. Closing thought, Jim Willie.
Prepare for disruption. People need to sell high their mutual funds at these high stock levels. We now have a big change that's happening. For the last 2 years, the major factor keeping stocks up has been a combination of Wall Street and central bank buying in combination with corporations buying their own stock, abusing bond issuance. Now they're stopping this. So the biggest buying factor is gradually sliding away. People need to start something that they used to do with smart heads on their shoulders. Sell high and buy gold and silver low, because we're starting the reset process. This is in a middle inning now of the reset. We've got a couple critical elements of the reset already kicked in. The voice told me the reset began in March. He told me last year the reset had its preliminary agreements made in February and March of last year, 2018, with the Petro Yuan futures contract in Shanghai. It completed the triangle of gold, oil, and RMB, all working together now in futures contracts, which means Russia can sell oil, accept RMB, convert to gold, all on Chinese soil, and have it delivered from Sberbank, which has an office in Beijing, Russian bank in Beijing. People need to prepare. It means selling your stocks and bonds because they're both going to be damaged. The dollar's no longer going to be the global currency reserve. We might have a 2-year transition period, give or take, I don't know, year and a half, where the dollar will enjoy the Western sphere dominance in this dual universe, where the RMB is going to enjoy the Eastern sphere dominance. People need to get out of their stocks and bonds that are dollar denominated and start getting into gold and silver, not the exchange traded funds, because those are very corrupt instruments. This is your opportunity. You need to sign up for the Hat Trick Letter, sell your stocks, move gradually into gold, coins, and bars, not stocks like the GLD and the SLV. Those are corrupted exchange traded funds. Of course, you can go with some of the major mining companies, and they might do well, but you got to be careful of them because they've got some false accounting. They got massive stock options for executives. You got big stock releases for big projects and their funding. I don't think the stocks are going to do that well. Some of them might. Some of them might be, 5 and 10-fold gainers. But I think silver is going to be equal or more without the risk. I'm told that gold is going to become the monetary standard and silver is going to become the technology standard. And within this tech standard, it's going to be a center for new energy systems. It's already starting. And it's not happening in the West. You have some people who are being murdered in the West because they're trying to bring this out into the open. Instead, it's happening in the East. So I actually believe Russia is going to be a sponsor in a complicated accord, a sponsor for releasing new technology, including energy systems. And for those who are slow to adopt, they're going to be buyers of Russian oil and gas. So that's how it's going to work. I encourage people to go to www.golden-jackass. The new hyphen site is active since January. It's fully operational. All the little kinks are gone now. It took a month, not much, just a few little kinks. And I was amazed how few there were. I was very happy. My guy is in Denmark. He's a smart whiz with numerous talents in the internet. I don't want to give away his identity in any way. And now we're just happy as pigs in shit. Things are really rolling along, and I'd like to see people move out of their paper instruments and start thinking about this transition toward the gold standard. We got a public page, as Paul mentioned. It's got interviews like this with links. I demand a link from interview hosts and usually get it, almost always get it. but I have a public article once in a while. I'm due for one. And come up to speed or just go straight and sign up for the hat trick letter. I like mentioning my compliments. They're fun. Jim, I was a hat trick letter client for a few years. I backed out a couple of years ago. Now I'm back in. I wish I'd never left. I missed out. Another one is I've been listening to your public interviews for quite a while, and I thought that was sufficient, but I know a couple people who signed up, and I thought, well, what the heck, I'll try signing up. I wish I'd signed up years ago. I love those compliments. I'm getting other compliments too. I forget what they are, but they're miscellaneous. Those are the two main compliments. I was out, now I'm back in. I didn't get in, now I'm in. I wish I was earlier. These are very nice things to hear, Paul. And people need to get informed about the alternative to the dollar that is coming, that has agreements already laid out. A lot was laid out in 2014, but we interrupted it and created the Ukraine war. We violated an international treaty and created the Ukraine war. Now, there's no new war to create. We're not going to have a new war with Iran to interrupt the new reset. The reset is coming, and it's already started. I think it's got 20 steps. If I had to guess, I'd say 2 or 3 are now implemented, including the gold trade note, including the big transfer swaps for central banks, as you started out, moving from treasury bonds, swapping to gold bullion for their central bank management. The reset has begun, people. So sign up for the hat trick letter, get a fresh breeze of how this is working, and manage your personal estate. So thanks for having me on, Paul, and this was fun. We covered a lot of really good material, and it flowed well, and I thank you for having me on.
Jim, thank you for joining us this Thursday afternoon and taking time out of your busy day, and we'll catch up with you in about 4 to 8 weeks to see where things stand. Thanks again for joining us at Silver Doctors, Jim.
It was a pleasure.